In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists have theorized that the human without access to any senses or ways could perceive stimuli, which would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believe that the five senses clouded our awareness of reality and eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God just by thought alone. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of said scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have even known. At this point, a sizable amount of scientists had left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives, so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked, but only for 3 days, until he started having severe, and I mean severe, night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subjects now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was so close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form any coherent sentence. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into this test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for what was the first time in the entire study. He whispered one phrase: "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." And soon after, his vital signs completely stopped. The scientists determined there was no apparent cause of death. A follow-up study in 2000 by Dr. G.F., Department of Neurology, withholding the hospital name of course, San Francisco, California, recent study of a degenerative disease which targets the motor functions and cognitive decline which often leads to hallucinations of the deceased. The death of targeted cells and chemicals in the brain by this disease leads to a loss of smell. Among other senses, the cause of the disease is unknown. Hallucinations present in 39.8% of the patients, falling into 3 categories: a sensation of a presence, person, a sideways passage, commonly of an animal, or illusions, present in 25.5% of patients. An isolated occurrence in 14.3%, foreign visual hallucinations present in 22.2%, isolating that in 9.3%. And auditory hallucinations present in 9.7%, isolating that into 2.3%. Continuing study in San Francisco, California, 2003 to the present. Now, a lot of people think the story is real, and hey, at first glance I said, why not? There could be a group of scientists trying to do such a thing. I mean, the world is a fucked up place, and there are quite the people out there, so why not? Now, it sort of reminded me of that one episode of Futurama where they're trying to hunt for God with a telescope, except, this one had some truly sick shit inside it, and that one didn't. Now, I will confirm for you right now that this event was fiction. It never happened. Trust me. After the research, you think something would show up more concrete than just this creepypasta link over and over again. So, no, it never happened. And if it did, you'd kind of see it being mentioned more so than ever, even nowadays. I mean, think about it. It's something pretty big. Now, what does kind of make it creepy is something along the lines was actually, and to this day, kind of done in real life to a certain degree. For example, in 2008, a BBC special featured about 6 subjects that were isolated in darkness for 48 hours. At the end, it was reported that they had hallucinations and what appeared to be decreased memory capacity. Heck, a year later in 2009, a study on the topic of sensory deprivation was taken on, and it confirmed that people who experience deprivation actually will perceive hallucination, especially if the deprivation occurs over a length of time. Now, you want to know the creepy thing? If you factor in all that, this stuff gets conducted as a form of torture, and they call it white torture. The groups such as CIA, or heck, let's be honest, the Russian FSB, Pakistani ISI, Israeli Mossad, or any top-tier intelligence group probably enjoys the heck out of it. By torturing an individual in the form of locking them in a small soundproof room with earmuffs and goggles, in about 2 days' time, or usually that's when it should happen, extreme hallucinations will begin to occur. Remember that study, right? And a complete breakdown can occur. Think about it, you're locking somebody in complete sensory deprivation, they're going to go apeshit and crazy. Now, bottom line, in the 80s, this experiment did not occur, but it is grounded in reality with how reactions were perceived in the creepypasta based on what happened in real life. At the end of the day, it was chilling, and when you get to that last phrase in the end, I have seen God, or talked to God, and he's abandoned us, you sort of have to think, is it either, true? Has this person spoken to God, or have they just gone completely crazy with all the hallucinations? Because remember, if they're not getting any kind of senses from around them with any of their body parts, their brain's going to make shit up. And it may make the creepiest stuff up depending on what that person has experienced and whatnot. And in all honesty, this creepypasta, when you think of it that way, is really, really scary. I mean, imagine being a scientist in that room. Imagine being the scientist that this person would stare at and tell that to. I mean, you'd straight up shit your pants. And that's what makes this creepypasta really chilling and scary. I mean, it's got this perfect campfire feel to you. You can tell it around a campfire and scare the heck out of anybody. But that being said, that is a gateway to the mind. And whether it was true or not, or whatnot, I mean, it's definitely, the experiment never happened, but if it did happen, whether or not these findings would be true, and in a creepypasta sense, if that person reacted the way they did, whew, that is some dark shit right there, let me tell you that. And in the end, I would always like to ask you, of course, in any episode, what would you rate it and what would you change to make it better? If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Check the link to the creepypasta in the description below. This has been another episode of Creepypastas. Dislike it if you dislike it. This is me, Mudahar, and I'm out.